All right, thank you for joining me and thank you for being here. I am Kasey, and earlier this month we did a whole video where I basically gush about Godzilla's first period in the Showa era. In preparation for that, you can be damn sure I watched everything Godzilla related from that period I could get my hands on. I do have all of Godzilla on a combination of DVD and Blu-ray, but for this watch through, I watched all the movies on either Shout TV or Max, so I could still show support for the franchise and for the little uptick in quality from a lot of my older DVD copies. I also watched them all in the original Japanese for the sake of my own preference here. Not that I think dub is in any way, shape, or form worse. If you are looking for the best way to experience the Showa era, you probably want to check out the Blu-ray set from the Criterion Collection, but that is still a little costly. If you are on a budget, a quick search of some of the archives on the internet will give you some solid results though. And I believe at the time of recording, just about everything is streaming on Max. For this marathon, I also tracked down all of the episodes from the original Zone Fighter series that feature Godzilla as well. This was my first time watching anything with Zone Fighter, so I was really excited to have something new to sink my metaphorical teeth into this watchathon. I also always like highlighting a few YouTube creators. I earnestly believe their work is just as important to the franchises as anything that is being put out commercially. But before we get to those and the Zone Fighter episodes, let's actually talk about the movies, shall we? 1954's Godzilla. It is constantly jarring how utterly dour this production is. It truly is a movie about the devastation and the anxiety brought on by a force that is so powerful you cannot even hope to escape its unfeeling wrath. There is nothing quite like watching a mother tell her children they are going to die soon to get you in the mood to watch a giant monster get just obliterated. Structurally, this movie also does a lot to keep its pace moving without the audience actually having a discernible goal. It is both concise in the edit while still spending a lot of time to meander and earnestly understand what's at stake. All, of course, accompanied by a score that adds so much metaphorical and literal weight to the production. It is a score that really makes Godzilla feel as big as he does, even over the excellent miniatures and effects. And the human characters that Godzilla fans love to pick apart, they are a pretty well-rounded love triangle that sorts itself while pretty seamlessly incorporating itself into the greater Kaiju narrative. That love triangle is a well-meaning addition that feels like it's partially there to hit just one more demographic, but does not really detract from the greater narrative and the weight of this movie's meaning whatsoever. So as far as I'm concerned, no harm, no foul. Godzilla raids again from 1955. Just imagine if Anguirus's spike back was able to come off like it was originally planned, like all of the weird fights we'd have gotten over the years. But this movie is not about that. It's about a couple of pilots who keep stumbling into Godzilla-sized situations. A second Godzilla, since the original did die in that first movie, if you forgot, fights a giant spiky kaiju whose name nobody can agree on. Throughout Japan, causing enough issues that our protagonists opt to step in, so we have a human-driven finale. I do have a soft spot for this movie. It appears more so than other Godzilla fans. I find it feels more like a sequel to that original Godzilla movie in tone and style than any other in the Showa era by far, while still making the movie less horrifically depressing. That being said, the final act does drag the pace of the production down immensely. Cutting what could have been one triumphant sequence into two did not work in the movie's benefit as far as I am concerned. Neither did doing the entire thing to no musical accompaniment whatsoever. It makes the finale feel like we are just kind of throwing ice cubes at a Godzilla toy. King Kong vs. Godzilla from 1962. Imagine being forced to be sewn into the King Kong suit only to nearly drown in it along with your friend in the Godzilla suit. That has to be the worst day of work ever. But we came here to see King Kong fight Godzilla, right? Well, first you have to watch a pretty fun comedy of errors with a couple of pharmaceutical reps hunting down the titular King Kong in order to get him from point A to point B, while the titular Godzilla slowly walks himself from point C to point B, culminating in a monkey suit on lizard suit fight that ultimately leads to the plot to just kind of conclude itself. From what I understand, the tone shift from the half-seriousness of Godzilla Raids Again to the slapstick comedy with, like, suit wrestling was due to the success of Mothra, from Ishiro Honda, director of both this installment as well as the extra dour original. If the whole big pharma and ratings plot was not so fun and constantly relevant and just well done, this might not have been the big success that truly launched Godzilla's dominance on the screen. Not that any of the kaiju moments on screen are not fun with their own well-done miniatures, they just might have some of the worst rear-projected sequences in the entire series. 1964's Mothra vs. Godzilla. When filling out my religion on, like, legal documents and forms, is it possible for me to just enter, like, Mothras? Because, yes, Queen. And there is a heavy emphasis on Mothra here in the title and the movie itself, while the whole human B-plot is driven by people trying to capitalize on Mothra's egg washing up on shore and her two twin fairies pleading with the best of humanity. That is until Godzilla wakes up about half an hour into the movie and lives up to the title twice over in ways one might not necessarily expect. In a lot of ways, that B-plot feels like a slightly more serious reworking of what we got in King Kong vs. Godzilla from 2 years prior, and it works really well for a B-plot, while the big fun kaiju stuff I'm sure a lot here are for is probably a little more up for contention. I personally love how much of a fight Mothra is able to put up, but in the process, Godzilla himself has never looked less competent in these movies, I think. Meanwhile, the compositing effects and miniature effects here are easily the best we've seen in the series so far. The small things like Godzilla being able to blast his beam while his head is moving goes a long way in making things a lot more dynamic feeling. This is made for one of my favorites in the Showa era by far, but I could definitely understand how people would be disappointed in Godzilla's portrayal in this particular movie. Ghidorah, the three-headed monster from 1964. And I think we should all watch this as the gods intended. A double feature with Elvis Presley's 1965 classic Harem Scarum. Here we have a kaiju feature that takes its time to give us an exciting science fiction mystery to focus on for the bulk of the first half of the movie, when a princess escapes an assassination attempt only to be possessed by a Venusian alien and become a harbinger of doom as kaiju slowly rise from their respective slumbers. When Godzilla does show up, it is ultimately entirely to throw down, whether it be Rodan or King Ghidorah after some convincing from one of the Mothra larvae that covered him in Discharge last movie. More so than any of the previous features, it feels like the actors and the suits are having fun for the first time in the series, keeping up with the same quality of miniature effects we got in the last production, but keeping the tone jovial. And this light tone soaks through the rest of the movie, whether director Ishiro Honda liked it or not, apparently. The more I watch this movie, the more I appreciate how the movie takes its time introducing the kaiju, its reintroducing of Rodan, and the introduction of the titular three-headed monster. But it's understandable to want to get to the first real kaiju rumble in the franchise, and it is a good one. Invasion of the Astro-Monster from 1965. So, how do you think Godzilla learned the Osomatsuken dance? Did we print a giant manga, or was an episode of the anime playing on a giant screen somewhere in the 1960s? Invasion of the Astro-Monster is more of an invasion of the Exilians, the alien race making their debut in the Godzilla universe with what will become their classic plan of acting nice and then releasing a bunch of kaiju on the planet. Well, Godzilla acts primarily as the victim here, being tricked into a fight with Ghidorah, then brainwashed and used as part of the Zillions' plans. For the people here for Godzilla, the new sequences we get are fun but few and far between. Even director Ishiro Honda would recount how he hated that he was forced to use stock footage in the picture. Alternatively, this movie does shine if you watch this for a fun alien invasion story, where the kaiju are used just as weapons instead of the main draw. I very much appreciate how every actor takes this story seriously when it would be easy to lean into the camp of the production. Studio-mandated white dude Nick Adams especially adding a lot more earnestness to the production than one might expect. Even if the movie doesn't always come together as my favorite Godzilla movie, there is still definitely a lot of fun to be had here. and Ebirah, Horror of the Deep from 1966. So we all know by now this was supposed to be a King Kong movie, right? The lightning, the damsel, and the not Skull Island setting. So comparing this with the King Kong movie we got in King Kong Escapes, do you think Toho made the right move in replacing King Kong with Godzilla here? As it was released, Ebirah follows a trio of dude bros looking for a lost brother and the master thief they kind of stumble upon, their ship wrecking, thanks to the titular Ebirah, on the vaguely tropical Lychee Island where they save some infant islanders from becoming trafficking victims, fight terrorists, and wake up Godzilla to do the heavy lifting and escape. Oh, and Mothra's there too? Oh, and a giant condor, how could I forget? Is the human story grounded here? No, but it's fun and pushes the plot forward pretty consistently, while the movie uses its budget and the island setting to give us a handful of pretty dynamic Showa-era kaiju fights thanks to some interesting camera decisions and actors who have now become the first veterans in their specialized field of suit acting, really. Mix that in with some well-performed and interesting characters, and you have a movie that I find myself especially fond of, which also feels might put me in some kind of minority when it comes to this movie. The Godzilla, Mothra, and Giant Condor costumes have always felt like they were falling apart here, which I think is part of that, but Ebirah himself, in the context of this movie, is executed better than you'd think a giant shrimp monster could be. Son of Godzilla from 1967. Okay, so real question is who wins between Showa-era Manila and Monster vs. Suko? Son of Godzilla gives us the quickest Godzilla action so far for a brief moment before we spend our time with our human plot for the movie. Scientists doing a science on a separate but equally nondescript tropical island. We bump into the titular Son of Godzilla and a congregation of giant praying mantises before the big man himself shows up to throw down with a Kamacuras, and then a giant spider in Kamanga, all while the scientists do a science and a little bit of romance. The puppeteering of the congregation of Kamacuras and Kamanga are definitely the highlight of this movie, but while I've never had a personal problem with Manila, even I have to admit that this is one of, and his father's, doofiest designs in the entire series. And I also cannot put my finger on why, but despite its similarities with the previous movies, with the tropical setting and all the laboratories, I've never been quite as fond of this Godzilla outing. Destroy All Monsters from 1968. Okay, so what do you think the actual destructive power of Manila's smoke rings are? Could they, like, crush a building? Are they a tangible construct? I'm really interested in the science here. And in case you did not know, this was also known as Monster Total Advancement. In the distant future of 1999, humanity has managed to round up every kaiju of note onto Monster Island, making it nice and convenient for the new alien race to proceed to mind control everyone and just wreck shop. Even with the promise of the destruction of all monsters, the bulk of this movie is about our human protagonist's mission to release the monsters from foreign influence, just in time for a final smackdown with Ghidorah and a flaming red herring. Everything involved with the kaiju and the miniature sets are especially well worked into this production. The little bits we get are some of the most memorable tokusatsu sequences of the original kaiju golden era. While the human story, which ends up being the bulk of the story, does feel a little more generic in substance for me, possibly because of rewatching these in like such short succession, I am reminded of how similar some of the plots end up being. This just isn't my personal favorite adaptation of either the Control the Monsters or the alien invasion story in Godzilla. 1969's All Monsters Attack. So what would you do if you were directing a kaiju movie and the studio demanded you direct it with literally no budget? You make a movie about the very real story of a neglected child being bullied while his parents work and daydreaming of stock footage about far more polished productions. Well, until Arrival 4. Manila shows up to give us some original tokusatsu moments between the Latchkey Kid story and the real world. Honestly, the idea to have the monster action take place in a daydream is a really fun way to write in the stock footage. The stock footage we get is also pretty well incorporated to the point where I'd wonder if someone who had seen this as their first Godzilla movie would notice how much of the movie is purely recycled footage. That and the real-world issues the production handles, and its downtrodden child story is largely well-handled and in an interesting way. This still very much feels like a 70-minute PSA about, like, stranger danger and bullying, but it's a pretty well-done PSA about stranger danger and bullying with some Godzilla stuff slotted in, so... 1971's Godzilla vs. Hedorah. If there's any Showa-era monster that I think is still relevant and should be resurrected, it's definitely Hedorah. Imagine Hedorah rising out of, like, Lake Erie in the Monsterverse. Right from the get-go here, kaiju are rising from the depths. Birthed from pollution itself, the collective organism we know as Hedorah is here to wreck shop while scientists do a science to figure out how to stop the monster, and Godzilla is pretty much just here to help. I don't know if there is a Godzilla movie with such deep valleys between its high highs and low lows and the weird fucking weirds. I love so much what this movie does, the messaging, the tone, the balance of human characters, and the kaiju. It's all really well done and in an interesting capacity. But in most instances, the physical manifestation of what came to screen is really weird and awkward. The more I watch and understand this Godzilla entry, the more I deeply appreciate Banno and all the work he has done for the Godzilla franchise. Whether you like this movie or not, there has not been a more devout champion for the king of the monsters, and we almost certainly would not have gotten Godzilla as we know it today without Yoshimitsu Banno. 1972's Godzilla vs. Gigan. Finally, in our little kaiju-a-thon, we get to my favorite thick-ass buzzsaw-chested chicken alien kaiju. Surprise of the century in the Godzilla universe, but aliens have invaded. This time they are cockroach people with a scheme to build a kaiju theme park and euthanize all the real monsters. How does that work? Is the implication Japan is just keeping the monsters around for tourism at this point? Either way, a mangaka leads the human plot in sabotaging the aliens from the M Space Hunter Nebula. So Gigan is my absolute favorite design for a Showa Godzilla kaiju, and my personal favorite kaiju in general, I think, maybe? It's a toss-up between Gigan and Gamera and Mothra, honestly. Despite this, Godzilla vs. Gigan is one of the movies I find myself flipping on maybe the most. Sometimes I find it absolutely boring and hard to get through. This time, though, I was really engaged, especially with the tokusatsu action, even if the use of stock footage is a lot more noticeable. The original action feels particularly intense, in part because of the large amounts of blood, but also the sound design kind of sells it. Oh, plus Anguirus and King Ghidorah are here as well, and they're great. 1973's Godzilla vs. Megalon. This is apparently the movie that caused a generation-wide, divide in the Godzilla franchise in the West. Do you think it was the movie itself, the cut-down edit, or do you think John Belushi making fun of the franchise as the host was the actual problem here? The movie itself is hardly about Godzilla, with Jet Jaguar taking the focus as the primary hero, a shape-changing robot made by a couple of scientists doing their science when a secret race of people called the Cetonians get a little uppity and send their pet kaiju Megalon to be a general menace to society. They even have the Nebulans from the last movie on speed dial to have Gigan show up because the suit was still just kind of lying around, from what I understand. Megalon, Gigan, Jet Jaguar, and especially Godzilla when he finally appears are what make this movie for me. Again, we have a bit of reusing of stock footage, but everything new is not only built around some great miniature sets and effects, plus the suit actors are giving some of the most dynamic and fun performances they have delivered in the franchise thus far. This makes for a great pairing with Godzilla vs. Gigan because of the reusing of monsters, the story elements, and the featuring of a tag team kaiju rumble in both. 1974's Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla. The amount of times different aliens have pulled kaiju out of their asses to invade the Earth is kind of staggering. At least this time it's a mech, built by a race of 8 people called the Simians. The humans this episode are focused on awakening the mythical King Caesar, another kaiju, to aid Godzilla fight his mechanical foe. The B-plot focusing on getting another kaiju up and running has been done more than a few times within the sphere of Godzilla movies. Here it is done well enough, but not incorporated amazingly into the alien or kaiju action in the long run, more so feeling like we plugged another story into the alien invasion plot. just to give King Caesar and a few characters reason to exist. If you appreciate the ever-increasing bombastic wrestling matches and miniature sets the series has led into, this is one of the best installments of this generation. You can feel the budget has increased in the special effects, especially over the last few installments, as we get a multitude of original and unstockified kaiju sequence in which we destroy miniature after miniature. It's a well-paced throughout production, so you always are left wanting for a little more, but never especially hungry for the action the series is now pushing. Except, during that song that takes forever. Terror of Mechagodzilla from 1975. As much as I love Mecha G, I do wish we went by the title of Terror of Titanosaurus instead here. It feels like it's his movie. Her movie, I think. As far as kaiju go, this really is Titanosaurus' movie, or the first half of it is anyway. As much of the runtime we are either searching for, directly fighting, or talking about a kaiju we haven't seen in nearly 50 years on the big screen. The human plot incorporates itself a little better than previously, with strong connections to some of the main cast, both for Titanosaurus and Mecha G. Honestly, Godzilla is the biggest outlier plot-wise in this movie for some reason, this kind of showing up more than halfway through in an otherwise well-paced narrative. The most generally accepted use of stock footage is used in an opening recap of the previous fights between Mechagodzilla and his namesake, but they also show up in a few quick effects later in the picture as well, which we never really like to see, but recognize they were on an obscenely tight budget and we want to blame the studio and not the directors. It makes every shot with Titanosaurus that much more exciting, since those sequences, as well as many overall, are shot dynamically with these great angles. This has always felt like a bit of a deflated ending for Godzilla Showa era, but at the same time I don't think it was intended to be that, but became so by circumstance. The movie has some genuinely strong themes, concepts, actors, and tokusatsu action, but it also falls apart a little bit in the edit at a few points, I feel. I feel like I'm not telling this well, but I promise you I did also have a really good time with this movie. Godzilla, King of the Monsters from 1965. Did you know Terrio Morse was chosen to direct Raymond Burr's movie here because they thought since he was an experienced editor, he'd be better at figuring out what would be needed to edit around in that original cut, which did cut a lot to squeeze Raymond Burr in wherever they had enough footage to shove him, really. So our new point of view character can watch the movie's real protagonists deal with a 400-foot tall radioactive unit that is Godzilla from just off to the side where he can talk about it to the audience. I think this might have been the first time I had seen the Americanized adaptation of the Japanese classic, since the DVD I first got to watch Godzilla on featured both versions, and I normally have the tendency to lean towards the original language if I have a subtitle. But this adaptation, I think, should be praised for all the things it does really well. Raymond Burr has always treated the franchise with dignity and respect, and Morse did an excellent job slotting Burr into the movie in a believable way. But it still cannot be perfect. Once someone notices this guy is just 2 feet out of left of all the important characters talking, it is impossible to not see the seams. That, mixed with losing so many of the powerful themes and messages in the editing process, definitely has me still leaning towards putting that original version on, if given the choice. 1973's Zone Fighter. Thank Godzilla! Every episode in this series opens with a brief breakdown of the general premise. Alien refugees from Peace Land are chilling out on Earth after the Garoga army did the evil space overlord thing of genocide. They send kaiju to Earth to wreck shop, and apparently the family of Peacelanders we follow can, grow to giant size to fight, or at least the dad can. The mom and son turn into the Great Saiyaman. I think that's how it works. Sure, whatever, I don't care. It feels like a middle ground between Ultraman and Super Sentai, but I could be attributing everything wrong here. None of these series I'm crazy familiar with. But the first episode Godzilla features in is Episode 4, Invasion, Grand Garoga Army, Godzilla Appears. I am not familiar with the characters yet, but we are doing an investigation when we are attacked by a toy plane, which is controlled by a shady Peacelandian when a wormy kaiju called Wargilgar shows up to be a hassle for the titular Zone Fighter. It's not until 20 minutes and another kaiju called Spyler comes into the picture that Godzilla shows up as a deus ex machina to fight for just 2 minutes, pound his chest like a boss, and then leave. Godzilla next appears in episode 11, titled Close Call: The Roar of Godzilla. Okay, so we are like 0.05 seconds in this episode from the titular hero getting Jean LeBeaud.
Oh, no, wait.
This episode goes pretty hard. We call in Godzilla to save the day, and the bad guys counter with Gigan. Honestly, the fight is pretty well paced, probably just as good if not better than any of the movies if I had to throw my opinion into the ring here. If you are just coming to Zone Fighter for Godzilla, this is a way better show for the king than episode 4. Next up is episode 15, Submersion Godzilla Save Tokyo. You are never going to guess what's causing all the unexpected earthquakes around Japan. It's a kaiju. We get a little more Godzilla than in episode 4, but mostly is used again to get the titular fighter out of danger, this time being buried alive. If I could give both Zone Fighter and Godzilla a small piece of advice though, maybe don't defeat the monster with a drill on its head and lives underground by burying it in dirt next time. Episode 25 is next. Carnage, Zone, and Godzilla vs. Terror Beast Grand Alliance. This episode starts out with Godzilla right away, set up in a way that you might believe they're going at it, but nah. They're just getting some friendly kaiju-sized training from a completely domesticated Godzilla. Towards the end of the episode, though, after Zone Fighter is in a spot we call in, I would argue for the first time properly set up, trump card in Godzilla who helps Zone fight off 2 legally distinct Hedorah in a pretty solid fight. Rock on. Moving on to the YouTube creators and their content, we have BigActionBill. Searching Godzilla on YouTube, one of your top results is going to be a BigActionBill video. He spent a fair bit of time in Japan and has been dissecting the Godzilla movies on an individual basis for years now. And his videos have only gotten more comprehensive and engaging as time has gone on. I don't necessarily agree with every one of Bill's opinions on the Godzilla franchise, but his videos are easily some of the most comprehensive when it comes to the history of Godzilla, and even if we don't see eye to eye on every Godzilla movie, I can tell he absolutely respects the effort and work that goes into every production, whether he likes the production or not. After putting on any Godzilla movie, BigActionBill usually comes after as great supplemental material to the movies. Wikizilla! They take a different approach at Wikizilla, focusing on each kaiju individually and their appearances over looking at the specific movies. This is a channel that almost could live in universe of the Godzilla franchise the way they analytically break down each monster, their abilities, and their histories. It is far from an objective series, still plenty of jokes and fun to be had, but this still feels more like a show and less like a documentary or retrospective, if that makes sense. I don't think that made sense. Wikizilla also does a lot more to bring in outside creators or hosts to cover different monsters, which goes a long way to adding variety to the channel and their set. They've also released several videos updating their information as more is discovered, which I always appreciate. You can tell the crew at Wikizilla do a lot to give the most accurate monster profiles on YouTube. Then there's MattDraper. If you checked out my short and sweet videos on the Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street franchises, or just quality people making YouTube videos, you probably heard of MattDraper or have come across his channel in the past. In a lot of ways, I modeled my channel after what he does, so imagine my stuff, but 5 times better at least. Draper's videos are a little more retrospective oriented, over focusing on a singular movie like BigActionBill. And in our case here, Draper covers the franchise pretty much in the same format I am. Showa, Heisei, Millennium, so on and so forth. Giving you a really solid, greater picture and general vibe of the Showa era, with some solid info delivered with all the energy Matt always brings to his videos. And we are going to end our discussion on the Showa era of Godzilla. Next month is my birthday month, so I picked a personal favorite series to cover in the Venture Brothers, but we also have a weird little extra week this month, and I'm going to make a concerted effort to fill that space as well, so look for an extra marathon in 2 weeks, completely unrelated to anything else going on. And I am also really, really, really bad at self-promotion. I started a second channel for a very different project of mine, in which I am narrating an ongoing science fiction narrative of my own making. Every Monday through Friday, I'm reading a full page. Right now, we should be 3 or so chapters in, or at least that's how much I have uploaded at the time of recording. So if a post-apocalypse science fantasy adventure sounds like you're kind of weird, please check out Endry-Mayon. A link will be in the video description to that channel. Otherwise, please keep being amazing and do some good today.